October 14, 1942. A village 38 kilometers east of Smolensk. The morning air carried the smell of burning wood and wet earth. SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood in the main square, watching smoke rise from the church steeple where partisans had fired on German supply trucks the previous afternoon. 31 years old. Graduate of the SS Junkerschule at Bad Tolz. 12 months on the Eastern Front. Iron Cross second class earned at Minsk. He believed in order. He believed in discipline. He believed in what his commanders told him about the mission, about the future, about the necessity of what needed to be done. The village had 217 residents before the partisan attack. Now it would have fewer. This was doctrine. This was policy. Collective responsibility. If a village harbored partisans, the village paid. This had been explained in training. This had been reinforced through 2 years of war. Brenner no longer questioned it. His unit had arrived at dawn. 2 squads. 23 men. They'd cordoned off the square. Assembled the population. Men on the left. Women and children on the right. The elderly in the middle. Standard procedure. Orders were clear. The men would be screened. Anyone of military age would be questioned. Anyone who resisted would be dealt with immediately. The women stood silent. Some held children. Others stared at the ground. A few watched the soldiers with expressions Brenner had learned to recognize. Hatred mixed with fear. Defiance tempered by the knowledge that defiance meant death. He'd seen these faces in 50 villages. They no longer moved him. The morning sun climbed higher. Shadows shortened. Brenner lit a cigarette. His hands were steady. They were always steady. This was his 43rd operation of this type. He knew the rhythm. The questions. The silence. The occasional resistance that had to be crushed. The reports that had to be filed afterward, precise and detached, numbers and locations, outcomes recorded in neat columns. A child cried somewhere in the group. A woman hushed it quickly. Brenner didn't look. Children complicated things. Command preferred when children weren't present. But partisan operations didn't respect such preferences. The partisans used villages. The villages became complicit. The children learned to hate. This was the logic he'd been taught. This was the logic that made it bearable. Obersturmführer Dietrich approached with the first group of men for questioning. 7 males between 16 and 40. They stood with hands behind their heads. Brenner studied their faces. Farmers mostly. Calloused hands. Simple clothing. But partisans looked like farmers. That was the problem. That was why screening took time. Why mistakes happened. Why the doctrine said when in doubt, assume guilt. The first man was 52 according to his papers. Too old for combat. Brenner waved him aside. The second man was 19. No papers. No explanation for why he lacked papers. Brenner made a mark in his notebook. The third man was 27. Papers in order. But his eyes held something. Calculation. Awareness. The look of someone measuring distances, angles, possibilities. Brenner asked where he'd been the previous afternoon when the attack occurred. The man said he'd been in the fields. Which fields? The western fields. Alone. With his brother. Where was his brother? The man pointed to another man in the group. Brenner separated them. Asked the same questions. The stories matched too perfectly. Rehearsed. Prepared. He made another mark in his notebook. By noon, 17 men had been questioned. 3 were cleared. 14 remained in custody. Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall, reviewing his notes. The numbers aligned with expectations. In a village this size, 3 to 5 partisan supporters was normal. 14 was high. But that suggested the attack had been locally organized. The entire male population likely knew about it. Chose not to report it. Chose to participate through silence. The doctrine was clear about silence. Oberfuhrer Schmidt had explained it during training at Bad Tolz. In the East, there is no middle ground. A man is either actively loyal or passively disloyal. Passive disloyalty enables partisan operations. Therefore passive disloyalty is active resistance. You will treat it accordingly. Brenner had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. The women remained in the square. They'd been standing for 6 hours. Some sat now. Others leaned against walls. The children had grown quiet. Brenner noticed this. Children usually cried during these operations. Today they were silent. Learning. Watching. Absorbing lessons they would carry forward. Dietrich brought the next group. 8 more men. The screening continued. Questions. Answers. Inconsistencies noted. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. At 3 o'clock, they finished. 21 men marked for detention. 6 cleared. The 6 were released. They walked slowly back to the group of women. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Brenner consulted his field manual. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. The first sign was small, 1942, barely noticeable. A village 38 kilometers while the firing squad was loading rifles. The morning air carried the smell of 20 meters away, wet earth, watching the process. SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood in the main square, watching smoke rise from the church steeple where partisans had fired on German supply trucks the previous afternoon. A girl emerged from the group of women, 31 years old. She was perhaps 7 years old. Graduate of the SS Junkerschule at Bad Tolls. Simple dress. 12 months on the Eastern Front. She held something in her hand. Iron Cross second class. A soldier moved to intercept her. He believed in order. She stopped. He believed in discipline. Didn't he believed in what his commanders told him about the mission, halfway between the women and the men against the necessity of what needed to be done. Brenner watched. The village had 217 the girl looked at the men residents before the partisan then at attack. The soldiers. Now it then at Brenner. This was doctrine. Showed no fear. This was policy, just determination, collective responsibility. A strange expression for a child to wear. If a village harbored partisans, an adult expression on a child's face. This had been explained in training. She held up what she was carrying. This had been reinforced through 2 years of war. Brenner no longer questioned. Brenner couldn't see what was on it from his distance. Had arrived at dawn. The soldier near her looked back at Brenner. 23 men. Asking with his eyes what to do. They cordoned off the square. Brenner waved. Assembled the population. Let her approach. Men on the left. This broke protocol. Women and children on the right weren't allowed near operational areas during executions. Standard procedure. But the girl was 7. Orders were clear. What harm could she do? The men would be screened. And sending her back forcefully would restart the age would be questioned. That would complicate anyone things. Who resisted would be dealt with better to let her deliver whatever message she carried. The women stood silent. Then returned her to the children. Then others stared at the ground. The girl walked forward. A few watched the soldiers with expressions Brenner had learned to recognize. Each step deliberate. Hatred mixed with fear. Brenner. Defiance tempered by the knowledge that defiance meant death. She turned and walked back to the women without villages. Nobody no longer moved him. The soldiers the morning sun climbed higher. Uncertain. Shadows shortened. This wasn't in the manual. Brenner lit a cigarette. Brenner unfolded the paper. His hands were steady. It was a drawing. They were always steady. Crude. This was his 43rd operation of this pencil. The paper was rough. The questions. Torn from a notebook probably. The silence. The drawing showed the occasional resistance that had to be crushed. Three figures that had to be filed afterward, precise and detached, numbers and locations, outcomes recorded in neat columns. Simple stick figures. A child cried somewhere in the kind group. Any child might draw. A woman hushed it quickly. Below the figures, Brenner words written in Russian. Children complicated spoke things. Enough Russian for field operations. Command preferred when children weren't present. He read slowly. But partisan operations didn't respect such preferences. Papa said we would grow wheat again. The partisans used villages. Papa said you would go home. The villages became complicit. Brenner stared at the paper. The children learned to hate. The girl was back with the women. This was the logic he'd been taught. One of the men against the wall was the logic that made it bearable. Young man. Obersturmführer Dietrich approached with the first group of men for questioning. Same age as the word suggested. 7 males between 16 and 40. The girl's father stood with hands behind their heads. The drawing was childish. Brenner studied their faces. Innocent. Farmers meaningless strategically. Calloused hands. It changed nothing about the partisan attack. But changed nothing about the men's guilt or innocence. That was the problem. Changed nothing about the orders. That was why screening took time. Changed nothing about why mistakes happened. But Brenner's hands had started shaking. When in doubt, assume just slightly. The first man was 52 according to his papers. The simple house. Too old for combat. The simple garden. Brenner waved him aside. The simple family. The second man was 19. You would go home too. No papers. He thought about his own daughter. No explanation for why he lacked papers. 8 years old. Brenner made a mark in his notebook. He hadn't seen her in 14 months. The third man was 27. She sent letters. Papers in order. His wife read them aloud but his eyes held something. Greta's letters talked about school. Awareness. About friends. The look of someone about waiting for Papa to come angles, home. Possibilities. About the war ending soon. Brenner so asked where he'd been the previous afternoon when the attack occurred. The shaking in his hands increased. The man said he'd been in the fields. He looked at the men against the wall. Which fields? 21 faces. The western fields. 21 men alone. Who'd been partisans or supporters with his brother. Simply silent. Where was his brother? 21 enemies. The man pointed to another man in the group. Said. Brenner separated them. Required. Asked the same question. Brenner had executed 43 times. The stories matched too perfectly. But now he saw something else. Prepared. He saw 21 fathers standing against walls in 21 villages. By noon, he saw wives and daughters questioned. He saw crude drawings folded in pockets. 14 remained in custody. He saw, Papa will come home. Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall, reviewing his notes. The firing squad was aligned with expectations. Dietrich looked at him. In a village this size, waiting for the command, 3 to 5 partisan supporters 8 men with loaded rifles. 14 was the afternoon sun casting long shadows. But that suggested the attack had been locally organized. The entire male population likely knew about it. One command and it chose not to report it. The reports would be participate through silence. The numbers would be recorded. The doctrine was clear about Operation successful. Oberfuhrer Schmidt had explained it during training at Bad Tolls. The command didn't come. In the east, he looked at the drawing again. Then a man is either actively loyal or passively disloyal. Passive disloyalty enables partisan operation in her eyes. Therefore just passive disloyalty is active resistance. As if she'd known. You will treat it accordingly. As if she'd understood something. Brenner had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. 12 months of operations. The women remained in the square. 43 villages. They'd been standing for 6 hours. He'd stopped counting. Some sat now. Faces he'd learned to forget. Others leaned against walls. Orders he'd executed without question. The children had grown quiet. Doctrine he'd followed. Brenner noticed following orders was what soldiers did. Children usually cried during these operations. Did. Today they were silent. Wanted to survive did. Learning. But the paper trembled in his hands. Absorbing lessons Papa they would carry go home too. Dietrich the girl had written it for him. 8 more men. Not for her father. The screening continued. The realization hit like a physical blow. She'd drawn the picture for the officer. The sun moved across the sky. The man with shadows lengthened. The man who pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook. For 12 months, Brenner had believed he had no choice. They finished. Orders were 21 men marked for detention. Doctrine was doctrine. 6 cleared. A soldier followed commands. The 6 were released. A soldier executed slowly back to the group of women. A soldier didn't question. Nobody spoke. Questioning led to doubt. Rushed. Doubt they understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Hesitation led to death. Brenner consulted his field manual. This was the survival strategy. Covered detention protocol. This was how you stayed sane. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. October 14, 1942 had shown him the flaw in that logic. A village 38 kilometers east of Smolensk still existed. The morning air carried the smell of burning wood and wet earth. That even here, SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood in the main square, watching smoke rise from the church steeple where partisans had fired on German supply trucks the previous afternoon. The squad is 31 years old. Brenner folded the paper of the SS Junkerschule, put it in his pocket. 12 months on the Eastern Front. Stand down. Second class earned at Dietrich blinked. He believed in order. Tell the squad to stand down. The authorization what his commanders told him about the mission, about battalion confirmed, about the necessity of what needed to be done. I said stand down. The village had words came out harder than intended before the partisan attack. Dietrich stiffened. Now it would have saluted. This was doctrine. Gave the order. This was the firing squad lowered their weapons. Collective responsibility. Confusion rippled through the village harbored partisans. This wasn't procedure. This wasn't how these operations ended. This had been reinforced through 2 years of war. The 21 men no longer questioned it. Their faces showed nothing at dawn. They'd accepted deaths. Now something else was happening. They'd cordoned off something unexpected. Assembled the population in its own way. Men on the left. Hope was more painful than resignation. Women and children on the right. He stopped 3 meters from them. The elderly in the middle. Studied their faces. Procedure. Farmers. Orders were clear. Laborers. The men would be screened. Men who'd worked with their hands their military age would be questioned. Men who'd chosen silence instead of cooperation immediately. Men who let partisans operate from their village. Some held children. Men who violated every protocol of occupation. A few but also men with daughters with expressions Brenner had learned to recognize. Crude drawings in their pockets. Hatred mixed with fear. Men who'd said, the war will end tempered by the knowledge that defiance meant death. You will answer a question, Brenner said in villages. His accent no longer was thick but understandable. The morning sun climbed higher. Fired at the supply trucks yesterday. Shadows shortened. Silence. Brenner lit a cigarette. The men looked at each other. His hands were steady. This was a test. They were always steady. An interrogation technique. This was his 43rd operation of this type. Then use it to extract information. He knew the rhythm. Several had seen this before. The silence. The Gestapo used variations. The occasional resistance that had to be crushed. So did NKVD. The reports that had to be filed like any other. Precise and detached. One man numbers and locations. Outcomes the young recorded father. In neat columns. The girl's father. A child cried somewhere no in the group. No one here fired anything. A woman hushed it quickly. We are farmers. Brenner didn't look. We have no weapons. Children complicated partisans things. Attacked from your village. Command preferred partisans when children weren't present. We could not stop operations didn't respect such preferences. They threatened. The partisans used villages. They left. The villages became complicit. Brenner children learned to hate. The man's eyes didn't the logic he'd been taught. Fear was there but also the logic that made it bearable. The kind of truth born from exhaustion rather than calculation. Group of men for questioning. If I release you, Brenner said 7 males slowly, between 16 and 40 partisan movements. They stood with hands behind their heads. This was studied their faces. Collaboration. Farmers mostly. Betrayal of the calloused hands. He would become an informant. But his neighbors looked like farmers. His village would know. That was the problem. He would be marked as a collaborator for life. Why mistakes happened whenever the war ended. Why the doctrine judged by his own people for this choice. The first man was 52 according to his papers. She was still watching. Too old for combat. Still waiting. Brenner waved him aside. He said quietly. The second man was 19. We will inform. No papers. It was a lie. No explanation was a lie. He lacked papers. The man would never inform. Brenner made a mark in his notebook. Would never collaborate. The third man was 27. Would say anything now to protect his child in order. Would vanish into the forest. But his eyes held something. The moment German troops left the village. This was predictable. The look of someone measuring distances did. Angles, but Brenner accepted the lie because Brenner asked where he'd been the previous afternoon. Some rational explanation for what he was about to do. The man said he'd been in the fields. Needed some way to justify the decision to his commanders. The western fields. To his men. Alone. To himself. With his brother. Return to your families. Where was his brother? Brenner said. The man's village is now under special observation. Brenner separated them. Future partisan activity will result in total liquidation. The stories matched only perfectly. The 21 men didn't move. Prepared. Couldn't believe what they were hearing. He made another mark in his notebook. Brenner turned and walked away. By noon, 17 men had been questioned. Behind him, cleared. He heard motion. 14 remained in custody. The men stood in the shade of a stone wall, reviewing his notes. Not running. The numbers aligned with expectations. Just walking. In a village this size, still not certain this wasn't another test, was normal. Dietrich followed Brenner to the vehicle. But that suggested the authorization had been locally organized. Will be reported as executed per doctrine. The entire male population likely knew 21 detained males were interrogated and released based on insufficient evidence of direct participation. The doctrine was clear about under observation. Oberführer had explained it during training at 1800 hours. In the East, sir, there is no middle ground. Those are my orders. A man is either actively loyal or passively disloyal. Then nodded. Passive disloyalty enables partisan operations. Walked away. Therefore passive disloyalty is active resistance. Could see the treated accordingly. Brenner had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. He would follow orders. The women remained in the square. Would keep his questions private. They'd been standing for 6 hours. The reports as directed. Some sat now. The soldiers began loading. Others leaned against walls. The operation was over. The children had grown quiet. The village was released. Brenner noticed this. Women rushed to their men. Usually cried during these operations. Children cried now. Today they were silent. The terrible tension breaking. Watching. Families reuniting. Absorbing lessons they would carry forward from the vehicle. Dietrich brought the girl and her father stood together. 8 more men. The man had his hand on his daughter's head. Questions. Protecting her. Answers. The way fathers do. Inconsistencies noted. Brenner touched his pocket where the drawing was folded. Moved across the sky. The paper felt like shadows lengthened. But he could feel it marked names in Brenner's notebook. Could feel the weight of what it represented. At 3 o'clock, they finished. Conscience. 21 men marked for detention. The capacity to say no even when saying no violated everything. The 6 were released. He'd crossed a line. Slowly back to the group of women. He understood that. Nobody spoke. Once you started questioning orders, nobody rushed. You couldn't stop. They understood once that you let conscience override doctor status, you couldn't uncross that threshold. Brenner consulted his field manual. He'd seen other officers make similar choices. Page 47 covered detention protocols. They didn't last long. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Reassignment. Both required authorization from battalion worse command. Things for worse violations. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. For this moment, 21 the message was encoded. 21 families were 12 minutes. One girl would see her father tonight. Proceed would hear him say again that the war would end soon. Outcomes by 1800 would draw more pictures of gardens and wheat fields and families together. He gave the orders. The convoy departed at 1,630 to the wall behind the church. The village disappeared. The women began wailing. Brenner sat in the command vehicle writing his report. Soldiers pushed them back. The words came automatically, not roughly. Professional military language. Standard descriptions. Clean numbers and outcomes. This made everything more documented according to regulation. The 21 men stood against the pocket. The drawing remained. They didn't beg. A child's crude sketch of sympathizers didn't. A small piece of paper that had stopped a machine. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. The convoy reached the battalion headquarters compound at Smolensk, a village 38 kilometers east of Smolensk. Brenner submitted his report to the duty officer. The morning air carried the smell of burning wood and was processed. SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood in the main archive of occupation operations from the church steeple where partisans had questioned the discrepancy between authorization and outcome. 31 years old. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, graduate of the variations happened at bad tolls. Commands 12 months on the Eastern Front. Situations changed. Iron Cross second-class earned field officers made adjustments. He believed in order. As long as the paperwork was complete, the system continued. He believed in what his commanders told him about the changed inside himself, about the necessity of what needed to be done. He lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. Village had 217 residents were quiet except for occasional coughing and the sound of men shifting in their sleep. This was outside. Sentries walked. This was policy. The collective responsibility of garrison life. If a village harbored partisans, the village paid. This had been explained in training from it now. This had been reinforced slightly outside of something he could no longer fully inhabit. Brenner no longer questioned it. The drawing was in his unit had arrived at dawn. He'd considered destroying 2 squads. Burning 23 men. Eliminating the evidence. They cordoned off the square. But he hadn't assembled the population. Instead, he'd placed men on the left between the pages of his field manual. Women and children on the right, hidden but preserved. The elderly in the middle. A small act of rebellion against the very doctrine the manual represented. The men would be screened. When it finally did, military dreams would be questioned. Not the usual dreams of combat dealt with immediately. Different the women stood silent. Dreams of his daughter Greta drawing pictures of houses and others stared at the ground. Dreams of families standing together in dozens of villages Brenner had learned to recognize. Dreams of choices made and hatred mixed with fear. Of yes becoming no. Defiance tempered by the knowledge that defiance meant death. He woke before dawn. He'd seen these faces and went to the mess halls. They no longer moved him. Oatmeal. The morning sun climbed black higher. Bread. Shadows coffee that tasted like charcoal. Brenner lit a cigarette. Other officers sat at nearby tables. They were conversations drifted past. This was his 43rd operation of this type. Partisan activity. The rhythm. Supply issues. The usual concerns. The occasional resistance that had to participate. The reports that had to be filed afterward, precise and detached, numbers and sat across from him. Outcomes recorded in the new orders came through. A child cried somewhere tomorrow. A woman operations in the forest sector. Brenner didn't look. Intelligence reports children increased partisan activity. Command preferred when children weren't present. How many men? But partisan operations didn't respect such preferences. Support from 16th infantry. The villages became complicit. Duration. The children learned to hate. 2 weeks minimum. This was the logic. Maybe longer depending on contact. This was the logic Brenner that made finished his coffee. Obersturmführer should have been approached with the first group of men. Another operation. 7 males between 16 and 40. But something in him resisted. They stood with hands behind their heads. The idea of returning to the forest. Brenner studied their faces. Of conducting searches. Farmers mostly. Of finding villages. Calloused hands. Of standing in more squares with notebooks and questions and authorization looked like farmers. He left the mess problem. That was why screening took time. The morning air was cold. Why the doctrine said when in doubt, winter approaching. The first man was already 52 according to his papers. In 6 weeks, maybe 8, for combat. The freeze would come. Brenner waved him aside. Would become difficult. The second man was operations 19. Would slow. No papers. But for now, the window was explanation open. For why he lacked Command papers. Wanted maximum pressure on Brenner made a mark in his notebook. Winter. The third man was passed by. Papers and POWs under guard. But his eyes held something. They carried logs for the calculation. Thin men in ragged uniforms. The look of someone measuring distances, angles, careful not to make eye contact with German soldiers. Brenner asked where he'd been the previous afternoon to when the attack completely compliant. The man said invisible if possible. Brenner watched them. The Western wondered about their stories. Alone, their villages, with his brother, their families. Where was his brother? Whether they had daughters. The man pointed to another man in the group. Whether anyone knew where separated them. Whether anyone was questions. These stories matched too perfectly. Or perhaps not new but newly noticed. Prepared. He'd seen work details. He made another mark in his notebook. Thousands of prisoners. 17 men had been background. Part of the landscape. 14 remained in custody. The machinery Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall. He hadn't considered them as individuals before. The numbers aligned with expectations. Hadn't wondered about their interior lives. In a village this size, but the drawing had partisan supporters was normal. A capacity for seeing that he deliberately shut down. But that suggested survival required locally organized. Not wondering. The entire male population likely knew about it. You couldn't function as an occupation officer if you chose to participate about what occupation meant. The doctrine was clear about silence. What it required you to do. Schmidt had explained it during training at Bad too deeply. In the East, he was wondering, there is no middle ground. Now he was considering. A man is either actively loyal or passively disloyal. These thoughts couldn't be stopped. Passive disloyalty enables partisan operations. 0800 hours. Therefore passive disloyalty is active resistance. Roll call. You will treat it accordingly. Announcements. Brenner had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. The rhythm of military life. The women remained in the square. Everyone in their place. They'd been standing for 6 hours. Following procedure. Some sat now. The machine functioning as designed. Others leaned against walls. But Brenner felt the gears. The children had grown quiet. Felt the mechanism grinding against some new resistance inside himself. Children usually cried during these operations. He gave the required responses. Today they were silent. Performed the required actions. But internally, something was coming lessons loose. They would carry forward. After formation, Hauptmann Weber summoned him to the command post. 8 more men. Weber was battalion operations officer. Questions. 43 years old. Answers. Career military. Inconsistencies noted. Professional. The sun moved across the sky. A man shadows spent 20 years learning how systems worked. The pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. At 3 o'clock, they finished. 21 men marked for detention. 6 cleared. The 6 were released. They walked slowly back to the group of women. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Brenner consulted his field manual. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. October 14, Brenner, 1942. Brenner sat. A village 38 kilometers east of Smolensk. Desk. The morning air carried the smell of burning wood and wet earth. SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood in the main square, standard decoration in every German command post where partisans had fired on Weber studied a trucks the previous afternoon. Your report from yesterday. 31 years old. The village east of here. Graduate of the SS Junkerschule at Bad Tolls. 21 males detained on the Eastern Front. All released after second class earned at Minsk. Yes, sir. He believed in order. Insufficient evidence of direct participation in the partisan attack. He believed in what his commanders told him about the mission, about the future, had authorization, about the necessity of what needed to be done. The situation changed. The village had 217 residents before the partisan attack. It became clear the partisans would have moved through but weren't based in the village. This was doctrine. The males had been coerced. Collective responsibility was secured through the warning system. If a village harbored partisans, Weber leaned back. This had been explained in training. And you believe this assessment had been reinforced through 2 years of war? Sir. Brenner no longer questioned it. Because in my experience, when partisans operate from a village, the village is complicit. 2 squads. That's been the pattern in 37 operations this month alone. Off the square. This one was different. The population. Different men on the left. Brenner hesitated. Women and children on the right. How could he explain? The elderly in the middle. The drawing. Standard procedure. The orders were father's eyes. The men would be trembling in his own hands. Anyone of military age understanding that he still had choice. Anyone who resisted none of this belonged in a military report. The women stood silent. None of this could be articulated in the language of doctrine. Others stared at the ground. Revealed nuances. A few watched the soldiers with expressions Brenner had learned to recognize. Was transient. Hatred not locally based. Defiance tempered by the knowledge as much as defiance meant death. I judged that future cooperation was more valuable than punitive action. They no longer moved him. Weber studied him. The morning sun climbed silent for a long moment. Shadows shortened. Then he closed the file. Brenner lit a cigarette. I'm going to approve this report. His hands were steady. Hauptsturmführer. They were always steady. The rationale is sound. This was his 43rd future operation is valuable. He knew we need intelligence more than we need reprisals. The silence. He paused. The occasional resistance that had to be crushed. Nuance is not our friend had to be filed afterward. The mission requires clarity. Numbers and locations. It requires consistency in neat columns. It requires a child cried somewhere in policy without getting lost in individual circumstances. Brenner didn't understand, sir. Children complicated things. Because what I'm seeing in your file children weren't present. 6 operations didn't respect such preferences. 4 resulted in releases. The partisans used villages. That's above average. The villages became way above average. The children learned said nothing. This was the logic he'd been taught. I'm not questioning your judgment. This was the logic that made it bearable. Not yet. Obersturmführer Dietrich approached with the first group of men for officers who start seeing too much nuance, 7 males between 16 and 40 exceptions. Those officers stood with hands behind their heads. They studied their faces. They undermined the system. I execute orders, sir. Simple clothing. I know you do. But partisans look like farmers. That's why we're having this conversation instead of a different conversation. That was why screening took time. Why mistakes reliable? Why the operation when in doubt requires clarity. Partisan activity is increasing according to his papers. We need results. Too old for combat. Documented results. Brenner waved him aside. Not more reports about nuance and future cooperation. The second man was 19. Cooperation. No papers. Understood, sir. No explanation Weber for why he lacked papers. Brenner made a mark in his notebook. The conversation replayed in his mind. 27. Weber had seen a pattern before Brenner had fully recognized it himself. Calculation. For releases in 8 operations. Awareness. Deviation from someone measuring distances, inconsistency, possibilities. But also 21 families still the previous afternoon when the attack 16 occurred. Men from another village. The man said he'd been in 11 from a third. Which fields? Numbers that meant nothing in the western fields. The partisan threat continued. With his brother. The war ground forward. Where was his brother? Individual lives to another man in noise against that larger mechanism. Brenner separated them. Yet Brenner couldn't stop counting questions. Couldn't stop seeing their faces too perfectly. Couldn't stop wondering whether his daughter would someday face a soldier with a notebook. He made another mark in his notebook. Whether someone would show that soldier a drawing. 17 men had been questioned. Whether that soldier would still have the capacity to choose. 14 remained in custody. The next morning, the company deployed north. Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall, 240 reviewing his notes. Trucks. The numbers aligned with expectations. Weapons. In a village this size, 3 to 5 partisan supporters was known for partisan concentrations. 14 was high, dense terrain. But that suggested the attack had been locally organized. Perfect guerrilla territory. The entire male population likely knew about it. The operation lasted 9 days. Chose not to report it. They swept through 17 villages. Chose to participate through silence. Encountered resistance in 4. The doctrine was clear about silence. Lost 3 men to sniper fire. Schmidt had explained it during training at bad partisans in direct engagement. In the east, there is no middle ground. 72 civilians for interrogation. A man is either actively loyal or passively stood in village squares with his notebook and his questions. Disloyalty feeling the weight of the drawing in his pocket, making choices that slowly passive disloyalty from the active resistance, carrying him toward consequences. You will treat it accordingly. Yet see but could feel approaching like winter on the Russian steppe. In 43 villages. The women remained in the square. They'd been standing for 6 hours. Some sat now. Others leaned against walls. The children had grown quiet. Brenner noticed this. Children usually cried during these operations. Today they were silent. Learning. Watching. Absorbing lessons they would carry forward. Dietrich brought the next group. 8 more men. The screening continued. Questions. Answers. Inconsistencies noted. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. At 3 o'clock, they finished. 21 men marked for detention. 6 cleared. The 6 were released. They walked slowly back to the group of women. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Brenner consulted his field manual. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. November 14, 1942. 19th day of continuous operations east of Smolensk. The village had no name on their map. Carried the smell of burning wood and wet coordinates. SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood in the main square, watching smoke rise from approximately 80 where had fired on the company had arrived at the previous afternoon. Standard sweep 31 years old. Perimeter established. Graduate of the SS Junkerschule. Population assembled. 12 months on the something was different. Iron this time the resistance had been waiting. The partisans had used the village as a staging area. He believed in discipline, probably for weeks. He believed in what his commanders told him about the positions, about the future, about the necessity of what needed to be done. Created interlocking fields had 217 residents. When Brenner's company moved in, the partisans opened up. Now it would have fewer machine guns. This was doctrine. Rifles. This was policy. Even mortars. Collective responsibility. The firefight lasted 3 hours. If a village harbored partisans, house to village paid. This had been explained in training. Brutal close combat. This had been reinforced by the time it years of war. 17 German soldiers no longer questioned it. 23 wounded. His unit had arrived at dawn. The partisan unit had been destroyed. Squads. 26 fighters killed. They'd cordoned off the square. But the cost had been population. And now Brenner stood in the square with 80 civilians, women and children on the right. Orders from Weber himself. The elderly in the middle. No nuance this time. Standard procedure. No interrogations. Orders were clear. No releases. The men would be screened. The village had harbored active partisan age would be questioned. The entire population would be dealt with immediately. Doctrine required liquidation. Silent. The word some held in Brenner's mind. Others stared at the ground. A few watched the soldiers with expressions Brenner had learned to recognize. A solution to a problem. Hatred mixed with fear. But standing in the square with 80 tempered by the knowledge that translated into something else. He'd seen these faces in 50 villages. 80 stories. They no longer 80 sets of choices that had led to this moment. The morning sun climbed higher. Among them was a family. Shadows shortened. A man. Brenner lit a cigarette. A woman. His hands were steady. A boy were always steady. A girl was his 43rd operation of this type. The girl reminded Brenner of the child from the previous village. The questions. Same dark hair. The silence. Same serious expression. Resistance that had to be crushed. She held something in her hand. The reports that had to be filed afterward. See what it was. Precise and detached. Numbers and locations. Outcomes his face was hard. Columns. He'd lost 2 men from his squad in the firefight. A woman hushed it quickly. Orders. Brenner didn't look. Brenner looked at his complicated commands. Command preferred when children weren't present. The need for revenge. But partisan operations didn't respect the village preferences. This was the partisans used villages. This was expected. The villages became soldiers who just lost comrades. The children learned to hate. The system was designed to provide. This was the logic that made it bearable. Oberstern Dietrich approached with the first group of men for questioning. Moved to execute. 7 males between 16 and 40. The soldiers began dividing the population. They stood with hands behind their heads. Men to one side. Brenner studied women their faces. And children to the other. Farmers mostly. The process was mechanical now. Calloused hands. Everyone knew their simple role. Clothing. The machine functioning as designed. Like farmers. But Brenner's hands were shaking again. That was why screening took time. He clenched them. Why mistakes happened. Forced them still. Why the doctrine said when in doubt. Looked at his notebook. Assumed guilt. Blank the pages. First man was 52 according to his papers. This time. Too old no for interrogations. Brenner waved him aside. 80 the second man was 19. 27 males of military age. No explanation for why he lacked papers. Orders Brenner clear. Made a mark in his notebook. Execute. The third man was appeared in his mind like a brand. Papers in order. Execute the order. But his eyes held something. Execute the males. Calculation. Execute the policy. Awareness. Execute the look of someone measuring distances. For meanings collapsing into one imperative. Brenner asked what he'd done the previous afternoon what you've done before. What the man said he'd been in the fields. He walked to the church. The western moment away from the square. Alone. Needed to think. With his brother. The church was small. Where was his brother? Orthodox. The man pointed to another man. Icons on the walls. Brenner separated Candles them. Burned out long ago. Asked the same questions. Damaged during the fighting. The stories matched. A shell had torn through the roof. Rehearsed. Cold morning light streamed through the hole. He made another Brenner mark in his notebook. Pew. By the wood was hard. 17 men had been questioned. He pulled out the drawing from his pocket. 14 remained in custody. Stared at the crude sketch of a house and garden and reviewing his notes. Papa said you would go home aligned with expectations. Outside, in a village the soldiers working. 3 to 5 partisan orders being given was normal. People being 14 moved. Was high. The machinery but that suggested the attack had been locally in 30 organized. Minutes, maybe 40. The entire male population likely knew about it. Reports would be filed. Chose not to report it. Numbers recorded. Chose to participate. The company would move on to the next operation. The doctrine was clear about but silence. Something in Brenner had finally broken completely. Schmidt had explained it during training that bad started with the drawing had widened in through the weeks of operations. There is no middle ground. Through Weber's warning, a man is either actively loyal or passively disloyal. Choices made and not made. Passive disloyalty enables partisan standing operations. At the point where execution was no longer passive disloyalty is active resistance became total. You will treat it according to it. Brenner had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. Couldn't walk out to that square and give the women order. Remained in the square. Couldn't watch 27 men standing for 6 hours. Couldn't hear the firing squad. Others leaned against the report afterward in professional military language about liquidation and necessary security measures. But
children
usually
usually
cried during these operations meant his own execution. Today they were silent. The SS didn't tolerate refusal. Watching. Didn't accept conscience as they would carry forward. Saying no to an explicit order was treason. 8 more men, particularly during combat operations. Particularly after German casualties. Answers. The military law was absolute on this point. The sun moved across the sky. Brenner sat in the damaged church, holding a child's drawing, facing the pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. Execute orders and destroy himself internally. They finished. Refuse orders and men destroyed for detention. No third option. The 6 were released. Just the consequence of allowing himself to see what he'd spent 12 months trying not to see. Nobody rushed behind him. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Saw Brenner sitting. Brenner consulted his drawing in his hands. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Recognition. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. He'd seen the change in Brenner over the past authorization from battalion command. Noticed the hesitation. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The deviations. The message was encoded. Sir, Dietrich said quietly. Took 12 minutes. The mails are assembled. Authorization granted. Brenner didn't respond. Proceed per doctrine. Couldn't find words. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Closer. Brenner returned to the square. Sir, he gave the order to know. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The question was careful. The women began wailing. A son tried to follow. His commander one last chance. Soldiers pushed them back. One last opportunity to recover. Just to step back into role. Standard procedure. To be the officer the system needed. Clean separation. Brenner looked at him. This made everything more efficient. How many children in the group? The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. October 14, 1942. Sir. A village 38 kilometers east of Smolensk. The morning air carried the smell of burning wood and wet earth. I didn't count, sir. SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood in the main square, maybe watching smoke rise from the church steeple. 25 children about to watch their father's supply trucks the previous afternoon. For harboring partisans, they had no power to stop. Graduate of the SS Junkerschule at bad tolls. For being in a village 12 months on the battlefield because of strategic decisions made 2,000 kilometers away by people who will never stand in this square. He believed in order. Dietrich said nothing. In discipline. But his face showed alarm. What his commanders told him about this was dangerous about the future, about the necessity of what needed to be done. Of refusal. The village had 217 residents before the partisan attack. I can't give the order, Brenner said. Now it would have fewer. The words came out steady. This was doctrine. Clear. This was policy. Final. Collective responsibility. I can't execute 27 men if a village the system says their village was complicit. This had been explained and children watched their fathers die. This had been reinforced through 2 years of war. Report about liquidation and security measures and necessary actions. His unit had arrived at dawn. I can't do it anymore. 2 squads. The silence stretched. 23 men. Dietrich stood rigid. They'd cordoned off the square. Processing. Assembled the population. His career was tied to Brenner's. Women and children on the right. Refused orders. Dietrich would be in the middle. Court-martial for both of them. Orders were execution for both of them. Like the men would be screened. But Dietrich surprised anyone of military age instead would be questioned. Of objection, instead of argument, anyone who resisted would be dealt with immediately. What do you want me to do? The women stood silent. Brenner looked at him. Some held children. Saw something unexpected. Others stared at the ground. Not agreement necessarily. A few watched the soldiers with expressions Brenner had learned to recognize. Recognition. Hatred the same weight Brenner had been carrying. Defiance tempered by the knowledge that executing operations too. He'd seen standing in square 50 villages, asking questions. They no longer moved him. Seeing faces. The morning sun climbed counting numbers. Shadows perhaps shortened. He'd also been carrying drawings in his mind. Cigarette. Perhaps he'd also been breaking. They were radio battalion, Brenner said. This was his 43rd operation of this type. Population fled during combat operations. The question. Village empty except for captured partisans and casualties. The occasional resistance request instructions. The reports that had to be filed afterward, precise and detached, numbers and coordinated lie that would require recorded in neat columns. But a lie that a child cried somewhere in the group. Time. A woman hushed possibility. Brenner send verification. Children complicated things. Aerial reconnaissance probable. Command preferred when children weren't the population. But partisan operations didn't respect such preferences. Hide them in the forest until verification. The partisans used villages, then returned them after the villages became complicit. That's desertion. The children learned to hate. Abandonment was the operational area taught. This was the logic that made it bearable. They'll know something went wrong. Obersturmführer Dietrich, but in the chaos of the operation, in the confusion of partisan combat, 7 males between 16 and 40. Reports get confused. They stood with hands behind their heads. Communications fail. Brenner studied their faces. We can create enough uncertainty that farmers mostly that we both get shot. Calloused hands. Dietrich finished. Simple clothing. Sir, they'll know. Partisans look like farmers. Weber will know. That was the problem. He'll investigate. That was why screening took time. Brenner nodded. Why mistakes happen? Probably. Why the doctrine maybe said not immediately assume guilt. Maybe not until the first man was 52 according to his papers. Maybe not until these 80 people have had time to disappear. Brenner waved him aside. To become someone else was 19. Dietrich stood silent for a long moment. No explanation for why he lacked papers. I have a son. Brenner made a mark in his notebook. 4 years old. The third man was seen him in 16 months. Papers in order. My wife sends photographs. But his eyes held something. He draws pictures of tanks and soldiers. Awareness. He thinks his father is a hero. The look of someone measuring distances. The words hung in the cold air of the damaged church. Brenner asked where he'd been the previous afternoon when the attack occurred. The breaking point for Dietrich. The man said he'd been in the fields. Send the radio message. Which fields? Brenner said. The western fields. I'll handle the population. Alone. Dietrich saluted. With his brother. Not the crisp military salute. The man pointed to another man in the group. An acknowledgement separated two men crossing the same line together. Asked the same questions. He turned and left. The stories matched too perfectly. Brenner walked back to the square. Rehearsed. The men were still separated. He made another mark in his notebook. The soldiers stood ready. By noon, 17 men had been questioned. The machine waiting for the command that would start it. 14 remained in custody. But Brenner gave different orders. Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall, village, reviewing his notes. Civilians to disperse. The numbers aligned with expectations. Take only what they could carry. In a village this size, 3 to 5 away from German operations areas. 14 was high territory. But that suggested the attack safer than locally organized. The soldiers looked confused. The entire male population likely knew about it. These weren't the orders they expected. Chose not to report it. But they executed. Chose to participate. Trained to follow commands. The doctrine was clear about didn't understand at first. Oberfuhrer Schmidt had explained it during training at bad Instead they were being told to run. In the east, there is no middle ground. The family approached Brenner. A man is either actively loyal or passively disloyal. The girl who reminded Brenner of the disloyalty enables partisan operations. You are letting us go. Therefore passive disloyalty is active resistance. Disappear. You will treat it accordingly. Again, I can't help you Brenner again. Had treated it accordingly. The man in 43 villages. Started to speak. The women remained in the square. Stopped. They'd been standing for 6 hours. Thank you to the officers who just killed 26 of his neighbors. Others leaned against walls. Who'd spent months executing. The children had grown quiet. Brenner was offering mercy only because something inside usually cried during these operations. The man simply they were silent. Gathered his family. Watching. Began walking north. Absorbing lessons others they would carry forward. Within Dietrich minutes, brought the next square was empty. 8 more men. 80 people vanishing into the screening continued. Brenner watched them go. Answers. Knew he'd just ended his military inconsistencies career. Noted. Knew he'd crossed into territory that had no path back. Shadows lengthened. The radio message was sent. The pile of marked names the responders came 3 hours later. At 3 o'clock, verification requested. 21 men marked reconnaissance aircraft. 6 cleared. Company to hold position and the 6 were released. Brenner knew they had maybe 12 hours before the lie was discovered. Nobody spoke. 12 hours before court-martial proceedings began. They understood that 12 hours of being the officer he should have been instead of the officer. Brenner consulted his field manual. That evening, page 47 covered post-writing protocols. One to his 49 covered execution guidelines. One to his daughter. Both not requiring authorization from battalion just saying command. Goodbye in ways that wouldn't alert military to the command vehicle to use the radio. Telling them he loved them. The message was encoded. Telling Greta to keep drawing. The response took 12 minutes. Telling her that when the war ended, authorization they would grow weak together. Proceed he pulled doctrine. Out the child's drawing one report last time. Outcomes by 1800 studied hours. It in the lamplight. Brenner returned to the house. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. Papa said you would go home too. The women began wailing. He'd chosen the drawing over doctrine. Some tried to follow. Chosen conscience soldiers pushed them back. Chosen 27 strangers over his own just survival. Firmly. The choice was stupid strategically. Clean separation. Pointless tactically. This made everything more change efficient. The war. The 21 men stood against the wall. Wouldn't save millions. Beg. But most it would save 80 sympathizers didn't. For now, they'd made their choice. For this moment. They would allow one girl to keep her father. Brenner respected would that. Allow 25 children to not watch executions. Professional. Would allow Brenner to face whatever came next knowing he finally said no when no was the only human answer. To reserve. Outside, the mechanics were familiar posts. Everyone knew their role. Prepared for the investigation. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. Brenner signed false reports with a warning. Both men working together to create enough confusion that maybe this was the pattern. The 80 people would have time to truly disappear. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. October 14th, flight arrived 1942. At dawn. November 4th, a village 38 kilometers east of circled the village twice. The morning air carried the smell of burning wood and wet photographic confirmation. SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood exactly as reported, watching smoke rise from the pattern of evacuation was wrong. Had fired on German supply trucks the previous afternoon. Too complete. 31 years old. Civilians fleeing combat didn't move in coordination at bad tolls. They scattered. 12 months on the eastern front. Left possessions behind. Iron Cross second-class chaos at Minsk. This evacuation had been orderly. He believed in discipline. He believed in what his commanders told him about military police, about detachment arrived, about the necessity of what needed to be done. The village had 217 residents, the kind of officer who specialized in investigating irregularities. This was doctrine. Watched the vehicles arrive and knew it was over. The investigation took 6 hours. If a village interviews with every soldier in the company. This had been explained in training. Examination of the village through 2 years of war. Physical evidence. Brenner no longer questioned. Timeline reconstruction. His unit had arrived at dawn. Was thorough. 2 squads. Professional. 23 men conducted many such investigations. They cordoned off the square. At 1800 hours, Brenner and Dietrich were placed under arrest. Women and children on the right. Falsifying military reports. Standard procedure. Unauthorized release of partisan sympathizers during combat operations. The men would be screened. The charges were specific. Anyone of military age would be questioned. The evidence substantial. Anyone who resisted would be dealt with immediately. The women were transported to Smolensk under guard. Some held children. Held in separate cells. Others stared at the ground. Courts-martial were scheduled for November 12th. Soldiers with expressions Brenner had learned to recognize. Standard military justice hatred mixed with fear. The outcome was defiance tempered by the knowledge that defiance regulations were explicit. He'd seen these faces who refused to execute lawful orders. They no longer moved themselves. The morning sun something unexpected happened during those shadows 8 days. Shortened. The 80 civilians from the village had disappeared into partisan territory. They were always steady. As this was his 43rd operation of this type. Word spread through the partisan network about what had occurred. The questions about the German officer who released them. About the occasional resistance that had to be crushed. About the consequence he was facing. The reports that had to be filed after. Partisan intelligence was sophisticated. Numbers and locations. They had informants in German columns. They knew about the arrest somewhere in the group. About the charges. A woman hushed it quickly. About the scheduled court-martial. Didn't look. And they made complicated things. November 8th. Command preferred when children weren't before the trial. But partisan operations didn't respect traveling between Smolensk and Vitebsk was ambushed. The partisans used villages. The attack was unusual. The villages became complicit. Extremely precise. The children learned to hate. The partisans destroyed the escort vehicles but deliberately avoided casualties. This was the logic that made it bearable. Then they stopped the convoy and delivered a message. Dietrich approached with the first group of men for questioning. If the 2 German officers currently held for trial in Smolensk were executed, they stood with hands behind their heads would begin targeting German medical facilities. Brenner studied their faces. Hospitals, farmers mostly, aid stations, calloused hands, clearly marked Red Cross vehicles. But the partisans looked like that had been mostly observed would be abandoned. That was the problem. Medical personnel would become legitimate targets. Why mistakes If the officers were released, the partisans would provide intelligence on a planned attack on German railway infrastructure. The first man was 52 according to his papers. Intelligence. Too old for combat. Brenner waved him aside. Personnel involved. The second man was 19. Information that could prevent significant German casualties and no explanation for why he lacked papers. The message reached Wehrmacht. Brenner made a mark in his notebook. The third man was 27. Partisan networks had demonstrated capability for complex operations. Held something. Medical facilities were vulnerable. Awareness. And the offered intelligence of someone measuring distances. A decision was made at levels far above battalion command. Brenner asked where he'd been the previous afternoon when the attack occurred. Further investigation was in the fields. The charges remained but execution was suspended pending review. Alone. What nobody told Brenner or Dietrich was that the reprieve came from the very people they'd been fighting. The man pointed to another man in the group. Had advocated for their lives. Brenner separated them. That the enemy had recognized something in their choice that was worth preserving. The stories matched too perfectly. November 15th, Brenner was informed his case was being transferred to rear area military courts. He made another mark in his notebook. Non-combat jurisdiction. By noon, 17 men significantly had been less severe. 3 were the likely outcome shifted from execution to remained in custody. Perhaps Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall, perhaps reviewing his notes. But survival. The numbers aligned with expectations. Dietrich received similar notifications. In a village this size, both men were transferred to a military prison in Poland. 14 was standard security. But that suggested the attack had been locally organized. The entire male population likely knew about it. The official explanation was administrative review, chose to participate through complications. The doctrine was clear about military justice grinding slowly. Oberfuhrer Schmidt had explained it during training something had changed. In the system hadn't worked as designed. Some variable had actively loyal or passively disloyal. Some force had intervened. Passive disloyalty enables partisan operations. Didn't understand how. Therefore passive disloyalty is active of unexpected mercy. You will treat it accordingly. The same mercy he'd shown to 80 Brenner villagers. Had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. Reflect the women remained in the square. Multiplied. They'd been standing for 6 hours. Some sat now. Others leaned against walls. The children had grown quiet. Brenner noticed this. Children usually cried during these operations. Today they were silent. Learning. Watching. Absorbing lessons they would carry forward. Dietrich brought the next group. 8 more men. The screening continued. Questions. Answers. Inconsistencies noted. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. At 3 o'clock, they finished. 21 men marked for detention. 6 cleared. The 6 were released. They walked slowly back to the group of women. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Brenner consulted his field manual. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. A military prison in Grounds held 300 German soldiers awaiting trial or 38 kilometers east of Smolensk. Not a concentration camp. The morning air carried the smell of burning Soviet facility. SS-Hauptsturmführer detention Klaus Brenner stood in the main square personnel who violated regulations were held. Steeple where partisans had fired on German supply trucks the previous afternoon. Food was adequate. 31 years old. Heat was minimal. Graduate of the SS Junker professional at cold. Brenner was assigned to cell block B, 30 cells. Iron Cross second class 60 prisoners. He believed in order for desertion or insubordination. He believed in discipline. A few for theft. He believed in what his commanders told him about the superior officer, about the future, about the necessity of the kind of charges Brenner faced. The village had 217 civilian populations during combat operations was rare enough that the other prisoners didn't quite know what to make of him. This was doctrine. Dietrich was in a different block. Collective responsibility. Contact. If a village harbored procedure for co-conspirators paid. The military wanted to prevent coordination of defense. This had been reinforced through 2 years of testimony. Brenner no longer questioned. Wouldn't testify against him. His unit had arrived at dawn. Knew their stories would remain alive. Squads. Both men had crossed the same line. They'd cordoned off the square. Both men owned the choice. Assembled the population. The trial finally occurred in January 1943. Women and children on the right. 3 months after the arrest. The elderly in the middle. A military tribunal. Standard procedure. 3 judges. Orders were clear. Professional officers. The men would be screened. The proceedings were formal. Anyone of military age would be questioned. Evidence was presented. Anyone who resisted would be dealt with. Witnesses testified. The women stood silent. The timeline was reconstructed. Some held children. The charges were detailed. Others stared at the ground. Brenner didn't contest the facts. A few watched the soldiers with expressions. Brenner had learned authorization for full protocol. Hatred mixed with fear. He'd released the civilians tempered by the knowledge that defiance meant death. He'd filed false reports. He'd seen these faces in 50 villages. He'd coordinated the cover-up with his second in command. The morning sun climbed higher. All admitted. Shadows shortened. The prosecution asked Brenner lit a cigarette. Why had he violated his hands explicit orders? They were always falsified reports. This was his 43rd operation of this type. Partisan sympathizers over military discipline. The question. Brenner reached into his pocket. The silence. Pulled out the drawing. The occasional resistance that had to be folded there after 4 months. The reports that had to be filed afterward. Precise and detached, numbers and locations, outcomes. He placed it on the table before the judges. A child cried somewhere in the group. "A child gave me this," he said. A woman hushed it quickly. "In a village we were ordered to liquidate." Brenner didn't look. "She drew it for me." Complicated things. Not for her father. Command preferred when children weren't present. To show me I still had a choice. Partisan operations didn't respect. The judges examined the drawing. The partisans used it between them. The villages became complicit. A colonel named Vogel. The children learned for a long time. This was the logic he'd been taught. This was the logic. Do you understand the implications of your actions? Obersturmführer Dietrich approached with the first group of men. If every officer refused orders based on personal sentiment, the entire command structure would collapse. They stood with hands behind their heads. Sir. Brenner studied their faces. Then why did you do it? Farmer considered the question. Calloused hands. How to explain what couldn't be explained. Simple clothing. How to justify the unjustifiable in military terms. That was the problem. How to make sense of a choice that made no strategic sense. Why because saying yes had become impossible. Why the doctrine said when in doubt. Because I'd said yes 43 times. The first man was yes made the next yes more difficult. Because eventually yes stops being a choice and becomes mechanical. The second man was 19. You've lost something you can't get back. No explanation for why he lacked papers. You've lost effectiveness. Brenner made a mark in his notebook. You've lost military function. The third man was 27. Sir. Papers and I found something else. But his eyes held something. I found that the capacity to choose still existed. Awareness. That even in the machine, the look of someone measuring distances, even after 43 operations, a man could still say Brenner asked where he'd been the previous afternoon when the attack occurred. The other judges whispered to each other. The man said he'd been in the fields. The prosecution looked satisfied. The Western This was a confession. Alone. Complete. With his brother. Clear. Where was his brother? The man pointed to another man in the group. Brenner separated them. Asked the same questions. The stories matched too perfectly. Rehearsed. Prepared. He made another mark in his notebook. By noon, 17 men had been questioned. 3 were cleared. 14 remained in custody. Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall, reviewing his notes. The numbers aligned with expectations. In a village this size, 3 to 5 partisan supporters was normal. 14 was high. But that suggested the attack had been locally organized. The entire male population likely knew about it. Chose not to report it. Chose to participate through silence. The doctrine was clear about silence. Oberfuhrer Schmidt had explained it during training at Bad Tolls. In the East, there is no middle ground. A man is either actively loyal or passively disloyal. Passive disloyalty enables partisan operations. Therefore passive disloyalty is active resistance. You will treat it accordingly. Brenner had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. The women remained in the square. They'd been standing for 6 hours. Some sat now. Others leaned against walls. The children had grown quiet. Brenner noticed this. Children usually cried during these operations. Today they were silent. Learning. Watching. Absorbing lessons they would carry forward. Dietrich brought the next group. 8 more men. The screening continued. Questions. Answers. Inconsistencies noted. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. At 3 o'clock, they finished. 21 men marked for detention. 6 cleared. The 6 were released. They walked slowly back to the group of women. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Brenner consulted his field manual. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. October 14, surprised everyone. 1942. The tribunal will recess to consider 38 kilometers east of Smolensk. The prisoner is remanded to custody. The smell of burning wood. The verdict came 2 days later. SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood in the main square, watching smoke rise from the church discharge from the SS had fired on German supply trucks the previous afternoon. Suspended 31 years old pending good behavior. Graduate of the SS transferred to non-combat assignment upon release. 12 months on the Eastern Front. It was extraordinarily lenient. Iron Cross second class sentence was standard for these charges. He believed in order. But Vogel had written an opinion. He believed in discipline. Brenner was allowed to read it before what his commanders told him about the mission, about the future, recognizes that necessity of conditions produce psychological stress. The village had 217 residents before the partisan duty creates moral fatigue. Now it would have fewer. That human conscience does not cease to exist even within military structure. Collective responsibilities were indefensible legally. If a village harbored deterioration rather than malice. This had been explained and granted due to the prisoner's prior service record through the 2 years of stress of 12 months continuous combat operations. His unit had arrived at dawn. Clinical. 2 squads. It gave military rationale for mercy. They'd cordoned off the square. It created precedent without undermining the population. Brenner understood what Vogel had done. Women and children on the right had found a way to spare him without appearing to condone his choice. Standard procedure. Had balanced justice with humanity. Orders were clear. Had recognized that some violations came from conscience rather than military age would be questioned. Dietrich received the same sentence. Anyone who resisted would be dealt with immediately. Same reasoning. The women stood silent. Both men returned to Graudenz to serve their time. Some held children. 3 years in prison. At the ground. Brenner spent them working in the soldiers' carpentry shop. Brenner had learned to recognize. Making furniture. Hatred mixed with buildings. Defiance labor by the knowledge that defiance while his mind processed everything that had happened. He'd seen these faces in 50 villages. He received letters from his wife. They no longer moved him. She was confused. The morning sun climbed higher. She didn't fully understand what he'd done or why. Brenner lit a cigarette. But she remained loyal. His hands were steady. Promised to wait. They were always steady. Told Greta that Papa had made a choice operation of this type. Greta sent drawings. He knew the rhythm. Dozens of them over 3 years. The silence. Houses and gardens and the occasional resistance that had to be crushed. Fields and sunshine and the peace. Reports that had to be filed afterward. She was 11 now. Precise and detached. Old enough to understand that war had changed recorded in neat columns. Young enough to believe he could change somewhere in the group. Other prisoners asked Brenner about his case. Brenner didn't look. About why he'd refused children orders. Complicated things. About whether it was worth Command preferred when children weren't present to answer. But partisan operations didn't respect such preferences. Comparison. The partisans used benefit analysis. The villages but his choice complicit. Hadn't been calculated. The children learned to hate. It had been recognition. This was the logic. Simple and absolute. This was the logic that made the girl's father was no different than himself. Obersturmführer Dietrich approached that the drawing in his pocket was the same drawing his own daughter would 7 create. Males between 16 and 40. That same no was the only response that allowed him to remain their heads. November studied their faces. The war mostly. Germany surrenders. The occupation ended. But partisans looked like genocide and occupation ground to was the problem. Brenner was still why screening took time. But the nature of his imprisonment changed. Why he was no longer a traitor to the SS. Assumed guilt. He was a German officer who refused to execute civilians. Too old for combat. Different Brenner waved him aside. Different meaning. The second man was 19. He was released in December 1945. No explanation for why he left his arrest. Brenner made a mark in his note to find a destroyed country. The third man was 27. His home in Munich had been bombed. Papers in order. His wife and daughter had evacuated to her parents' farm in Bavaria. Calculation. He found awareness. The look of someone measuring distances, angles, traumatized by years of war. Brenner asked where he'd been the previous afternoon when the attack occurred. Greta was 13. The man said he'd been in the fields. She'd grown. Which fields? Changed. The western fields. She looked at her father like a stranger at first. With his brother.
3 years was a lifetime.
Where
at
was
that
his
age.
brother?
But
then
then
she
she
pulled out another man
of
in
drawings
the
she'd saved.
Brenner separated
Showed
them.
him each one.
Asked the same
Explained
questions.
them.
The
Then
stories
slowly,
matched
over
too
days and
perfectly.
weeks, they rebuilt
Rehearsed.
connection.
She
Prepared.
asked him once why he'd gone
He made
to prison.
another mark in his notebook.
He told her about the village.
By noon, 17
about
men
the
had been
family.
questioned.
About the drawing
3
another
were clear.
girl had given him.
14
About the
remained
choice
in
he'd
custody.
made. Brenner
She
stood
listened
in the shade of a
quietly.
stone wall,
Then
reviewing
she
his
said,
notes.
"Did it help them?
The numbers aligned with
family?
expectations.
I don't know."
In a
Brenner
village this
admitted.
size, 3 to
They
5
disappeared.
partisan supporters was normal.
I never learned what happened to them.
14 was high. Greta thought about
But
that.
suggested the attack had
Then
been
she
locally
said,
organized.
"But you know you tried. The entire male
That's what
population
matters.
likely knew about it. That you tried to help
Chose
when you
not
could.
to report it.
The simplicity
Chose
of
to
her
participate
understanding
through
hit him harder
silence.
than any judicial
The
opinion.
doctrine was clear about
She
silence.
reduced it to its essence.
Oberfuhrer Schmidt
Not
had explained
strategy.
it during training at bad tolls.
Not policy. In the East,
Not the weight
there is
of
no
military
middle
law.
ground. Just
A
the
man is
basic
either
human
actively
equation.
loyal or passively disloyal.
Someone needed help. Passive
He tried to
disloyalty
help.
enables partisan
The
operations.
outcome was uncertain.
Therefore passive
The attempt
disloyalty
was what
is
mattered.
active resistance. You will treat it accordingly. Brenner had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. The women remained in the square. They'd been standing for 6 hours. Some sat now. Others leaned against walls. The children had grown quiet. Brenner noticed this. Children usually cried during these operations. Today they were silent. Learning. Watching. Absorbing lessons they would carry forward. Dietrich brought the next group. 8 more men. The screening continued. Questions. Answers. Inconsistencies noted. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. At 3 o'clock, they finished. 21 men marked for detention. 6 cleared. The 6 were released. They walked slowly back to the group of women. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Brenner consulted his field manual. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. The years after the war were 1942. Germany rebuilt a village 38 kilometers east of Smolensk. Construction. The morning physical labor, the smell of burning wood and wet different earth. Kind and prison but similar SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner stood in the main square, watching smoke rise from his the body adapted to civilian life, fired on German supply trucks. But his mind remained marked by the choice he'd made in that 31 years old. He never spoke about the SS Junkerschule at bad tolls. Didn't testify at trials. 12 months on the Eastern Front. Didn't write memoirs. Iron Cross second class remained private. His family in order. A few friends eventually learned. He believed in what his commanders told him about the mission. Another veteran with another war story that didn't fit the narrative anyone wanted to tell. The village had 217 residents before the partisan unexpected happened. Now it would have a letter arrived from the Soviet Union. This was doctrine. Unusual this enough was that policy. Brenner almost didn't open it. Collective responsibility. Soviet correspondence was rare. If a village harbored partisans, dangerous the village paid. The Cold had been explained in training. This had been reinforced through 2 years of war. But curiosity Brenner no longer questioned it. The letter was in Russian. His unit had arrived at dawn. Brenner's language skills were rusty but functional. 23
He
men.
translated slowly.
They'd cordoned off the
Dear
square.
Herr Brenner.
Assembled
I
the
am writing
population.
to inform you of the survival
Men
of
on the
83
left.
individuals from a village
Women
near
and children on the
Smolensk.
right.
In November
The elderly in the
1942,
these people were
standard
released by a
procedure.
German officer during
Orders
combat
were clear.
operations. The
They
men would be
fled into
screened.
partisan territory.
Anyone of military
Many
age would be
survived the war.
questioned.
Some
Anyone
did
who
not.
resisted would be dealt with
But
immediately.
those who survived remember the
The
choice
women
that
stood
officer
silent.
made.
I
Some
was one of
held
those
children.
people.
Others
I was
stared
6
at the
years
ground.
old.
A
I
few
gave you a
watched the
drawing.
soldiers with expressions
You
Brenner
kept
had
it.
learned to recognize.
You released my father
Hatred
and
mixed
26
with
other
fear.
men.
Because
Defiance
of that
tempered by
choice,
the knowledge
I grew
that
up.
defiance meant death.
I married.
He'd seen these
I had
faces in
children.
50 villages.
My father saw
They
his
no longer
grandchildren
moved
before
him.
he died in 1958.
The morning sun climbed higher.
I cannot say your choice
Shadows
was right or
shortened.
wrong.
Brenner
War
lit a
creates
cigarette.
impossible situations.
His hands were steady,
but I can say it
they
gave
were
us
always
time.
steady.
Time to
This
run.
was his 43rd operation of his
hide.
type.
Time to
He
live.
knew the rhythm.
For that,
The questions.
I thank you.
The
I
silence.
do not expect response.
The occasional resistance
I do not
that had to be
expect forgiveness
crushed.
for what the war did to
The
all of
reports
us.
that had to be filed afterward.
I write only so
precise
you know.
and detached. Numbers
Your
and
choice
locations.
mattered.
Outcomes recorded
It
in
saved
neat columns.
lives. A
It
child
created
cried
futures
somewhere
that
in
would
the
not
group.
have existed.
A woman hushed
Perhaps
it
that
quickly.
is enough.
Brenner didn't
Elena
look.
Sokolova.
Children complicated
Brenner read the
things.
letter 3 times.
Command preferred when
Sat
children
with it for
weren't
an hour.
present. Tried to
partisan
remember the girl's
operations
face.
didn't respect such
Couldn't
preferences.
quite retrieve it.
The partisans
But he
used
remembered the
villages.
drawing.
The villages
Remembered his
became
daughter's
complicit.
voice saying, "You tried
The
to
children
help when you
learned to
could."
hate.
He wrote
This
back.
was the logic he'd been taught.
A short letter.
This was the logic
Careful.
that made it bearable.
Acknowledging her message.
Obersturmführer Dietrich approached
Expressing
with the first
relief
group of
that
men
she
for
survived.
questioning. Not
7 males
apologizing.
between 16 and 40.
Not justifying.
They stood with hands
Just
behind their
acknowledging.
heads. 2 people
Brenner
connected
studied
by
their
a moment of
faces.
choice.
Farmers
Separated
mostly.
by war and politics
Calloused
and
hands.
decades.
But
Simple
briefly,
clothing.
unexpectedly,
But partisans
reconnected.
looked like farmers.
The correspondence
That was
continued
the problem.
irregularly over the next decade.
That was why screening took
Letters
time.
every few years.
Why mistakes happened.
Updates on families.
Why the doctrine said when in
News of
doubt,
children and
assume
grandchildren.
guilt.
The first
Nothing
man was
political.
52 according to his
Just
papers.
2 people maintaining a thread
Too
of
old
connection
for
across
combat.
the divide of history.
Brenner waved him aside.
Elena sent photographs
The
eventually.
second man was 19.
Her family.
No papers.
Her children.
No
Her
explanation
father
for
before
why he
lacked
died.
papers.
Standing in a garden.
Brenner made a mark in his
Growing
notebook.
wheat. The
The
third
image from
man
the
was
drawing made
27.
real. A
Papers in
future that
order.
almost hadn't existed.
But his eyes held something.
Preserved because of a decision made in
Calculation.
a village square in November
Awareness.
1942.
The look of someone measuring distances, angles, possibilities.
Brenner asked where he'd been the previous afternoon when the attack occurred.
The man said he'd been in the fields. Which fields?
The western fields.
Alone. With his brother. Where was his brother? The man pointed to another man in the group. Brenner separated them. Asked the same questions. The stories matched too perfectly. Rehearsed. Prepared. He made another mark in his notebook. By noon, 17 men had been questioned. 3 were cleared. 14 remained in custody. Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall, reviewing his notes. The numbers aligned with expectations. In a village this size, 3 to 5 partisan supporters was normal. 14 was high. But that suggested the attack had been locally organized. The entire male population likely knew about it. Chose not to report it. Chose to participate through silence. The doctrine was clear about silence. Oberfuhrer Schmidt had explained it during training at Bad Tolls. In the East, there is no middle ground. A man is either actively loyal or passively disloyal. Passive disloyalty enables partisan operations. Therefore passive disloyalty is active resistance. You will treat it accordingly. Brenner had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. The women remained in the square. They'd been standing for 6 hours. Some sat now. Others leaned against walls. The children had grown quiet. Brenner noticed this. Children usually cried during these operations. Today they were silent. Learning. Watching. Absorbing lessons they would carry forward. Dietrich brought the next group. 8 more men. The screening continued. Questions. Answers. Inconsistencies noted. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. At 3 o'clock, they finished. 21 men marked for detention. 6 cleared. The 6 were released. They walked slowly back to the group of women. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Brenner consulted his field manual. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. October Brenner died in Munich in 1989. A village 38 kilometers east of Smolensk. Heart failure. The morning air carried by the smell of burning wood and wet earth. His wife, SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner, stood in the main square, grandchildren, watching smoke rise from the church steeple where partisans had fired on German supply trucks the previous afternoon. Not about the years old. Not about the trauma of the SS Junkerschule, about his choices. 12 months on the Eastern Front, that saying no sometimes required more courage than saying yes. He believed in the drawing. He believed in the Soviet girl. He believed in what his commanders told him about the mission, about the preserved in a frame, about the necessity of what needed to be done. She explained what it meant. The village had 217 residents before the partisan attack. How it had saved 83 people. Now it would have fewer. How it represented the capacity for choice even inside systems designed to eliminate collective responsibility. After the funeral, if a village harbored partisans, the village paid. German. This had been explained in training. She introduced herself as Anna 2 years of war. Daughter of Brenner no longer questioned the military police officer who investigated Brenner's case in 1942. Squads. My father told me about your father's trial. They cordoned off the square. He was impressed by his testimony. Population. By his refusal to justify or excuse. Women and children on the right. By his simple admission that the elderly in the middle. She standard procedure. My father said it was the only trial he investigated. The men would be screened, showed no fear. Anyone of military age would be questioned. Just acceptance of consequence. Anyone who resisted would be dealt with immediately. He said that kind of courage was rare. The women stood silent. Greta thanked her. Some held children. The women talked briefly. Others stared at the ground. Exchanged addresses. A few watched the soldiers with expressions Brenner had learned to recognize. 2 daughters of men on opposite sides of a legal proceeding, recognizing something valuable by the knowledge that their fathers had each done their duty while preserving humanity. He'd seen these faces in 50 villages. The story might have ended there. They no longer moved. A private legacy. The morning sun climbed higher. But in 1997, Elena Sokolova's grandson, Mikhail, his hands were steady. He specialized in partisan operations during World War II. This was his 43rd operation of this type. While researching his dissertation, he discovered references to an unusual incident in November 1942. The occasional resistance that reported civilian evacuation during combat. The reports that had to be filed afterward. Partisan intelligence that mentioned German numbers and location villagers. Outcomes recorded in he investigated. A child cried somewhere in the group. A woman transcribed quickly. Correspondence between his grandmother and children complicated things. He assembled the full story. Command preferred when children published it in a historical journal. But partisan operations didn't respect such preferences. Limited circulation. The partisans used villages. But precise. The villages became complicit. Verified. The children learned to hate. The article attracted attention. This was the logic he'd been taught. Other historians found this was the logic that made it bearable. Not many. Obersturmführer enough to suggest the first group of men for questioning. Officers who'd refused orders. 7 males between 16 and 40. Soldiers who'd made individual choices against hands behind their heads. Small acts of conscience inside large machines of farmers mostly. The scholarship began documenting these moments. Simple clothing. Not to excuse. But partisans looked like farmers. Not to minimize the larger horror. That was the problem. But to acknowledge that even in the darkest systems, some individuals found ways to say no. Why the doctrine story became part of that scholarship. The first man was 52 according to his papers. Not a redemption tale. Too old for combat. Just documentation of a choice. Brenner waved him aside. Its context. The second man was 19. Its consequence. No papers. It's small but measurable impact. No explanation for why he lacked papers. The drawing hangs in a small museum made a mark in his notebook dedicated to civilian experiences. The third man was 27. It's in a section about moral choice. But his eyes held something. About the space between orders and execution. Awareness. About the fact that individual human beings measuring distance even within systems designed to eliminate decision-making. Brenner asked where he'd been to the drawing as Brenner's testimony from his trial. The man said he'd been in the fields. Because saying yes had become impossible. The western fields. Because I'd said yes alone. 43 times before with his and brother. Each yes made the next yes more difficult. The man pointed to another man in being a choice and becomes mechanical. Brenner separated them. And when it's mechanical, the same you've lost something you can't get back. The stories matched too below perfectly. That, a note from Elena. Rehearsed. Written in her 80s, before she died. He made another mark in his notebook. He gave me my life. By noon, he gave my father time to see grandchildren. 3 were clear. He gave 83 people futures 14 that remained in custody. The war Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall. His choice saved his dozens. The numbers aligned with expectations. That's nothing. In a village for those dozens, 3 to 5 partisans for their grandchildren, normal. It's everything. 14 was high. The museum is small, but that suggested not the attack had been locally organized. Mostly students. The entire male population likely knew about it. People interested in the complicated history of individual choice during systematic through silence. They stand before the clear about silence. Look at the crude sketch of a house and garden explained it during training at Bad Tolls. Read the testimony. In the East, there is no middle ground. Try to understand how something so loyal or carry so much weight. What they're looking at is not enables partisan operation, not redemption. Therefore passive disloyalty is any organized sense. You will what they're looking at is the moment when a man recognized had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. When conscience pierced through training and doctrine and survival instinct. They'd been standing for 6 hours. When a child's drawing carried more weight than military orders. Others leaned against walls. The children had grown quiet. Brenner noticed this. Children usually cried during these operations. Today they were silent. Learning. Watching. Absorbing lessons they would carry forward. Dietrich brought the next group. 8 more men. The screening continued. Questions. Answers. Inconsistencies noted. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. At 3 o'clock, they finished. 21 men marked for detention. 6 cleared. The 6 were released. They walked slowly back to the group of women. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Brenner consulted his field manual. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed. October 14th, didn't stop the war. 1942 didn't prevent atrocity. A village 38 kilometers east of Smolensk. But the morning air carried the smell of burning wood and it demonstrated that even inside machinery designed to eliminate Klaus Brenner stood in the main square, watching smoke rise from the capacity to say no remains had fired on German supply trucks. The obligation to recognize the capacity, to 31 years old, to understand its weight, graduate of the SS Junkerschule. The drawing is faded now. 12 months on the Eastern Front. Conservation experts debate how much longer it can be displayed before it deteriorates completely. He believed in eventually it will crumble. He believed in what his commanders told him about the mission, about the future, but the image necessity of what needed to be done. Digitized. The village had 217 residents before the partisan attack. And the story endures. Now it would have fewer. Not as legend. This was doctrine. Not as myth. This was policy. But as documentation. Collective responsibility. Proof that one man faced an impossible choice and chose the village paid. That had been explained in training. This had been reinforced through 2 years of war. Brenner no longer questioned lived who might not have lived. His unit had arrived at dawn. That their children and grandchildren exist because of a decision made in a village square in November 1942. They cordoned off the square. In the end, assembled the population. Not that Brenner was a hero. Women and children on the right. He executed 43 operations before he broke. Standard procedure. He participated in the machinery of occupation and genocide for 12 months before conscience finally pierced the military age would be questioned. He waited until the moment was personally would be dealt with immediately. He said no. The women stood silent. Came, when the drawing was placed in his hand, when the girl looked at him with expectation, when the choice became unavoidable, the soldiers with expressions Brenner had learned to recognize. He chose conscience. Hatred mixed with fear. He chose to say no even knowing defiance the consequence. Tempered by the knowledge that defiance meant death. He chose 83 strangers over his own survival. These faces in 50 villages. He chose the drawing over doctrine. They no longer moved him. That choice didn't absolve him. The morning sun climbed higher. Didn't erase the previous shadows shortened. Didn't redeem the system he'd served. His hands were steady. But it demonstrated that within that system, they were always steady. Within the machinery of horror, this was his 43rd operation of the capacity to choose. He knew the rhythm. That capacity is what the drawing represents. The silence. What it preserves. The occasional resistance that had to be crushed. A child drew a picture the reports of hope that had to be filed after an officer recognized that hope as commanders and locations than military outcomes recorded in neat columns. He obeyed that command. A child cried somewhere in the group. He paid the price. A woman hushed it quickly. The consequence. Brenner didn't look. He lived long enough to learn his complicated things. That's the story. Command preferred when children weren't present. Nothing less. Partisan operations didn't respect a child's drawing that made a hard officer lower his gun. The partisans used villages. A moment of choice. The villages became complicit. A ripple of consequence. The children learned to hate. A legacy of recognition that even in the darkest places taught. Choice persists. This was the logic that made it endures. Humanity survived. Approached with the first group of men for questioning. The war ended 78 years ago. 7 males between 16 and 40. The child is dead with hands behind their heads. But the drawing remains. Brenner studied their faces. And with it, the question it asks every person who sees it. Calloused hands. When the moment comes, simple clothing. When the choice is yours. But partisans look like when farmers. Doctrine demands one thing and conscience demands another. That was why when the machine requires yes but humanity why requires mistakes no. Happened. What will why you choose? The doctrine said when in doubt. The drawing doesn't answer that question. The first man was only 52 according to his papers. Quietly. Too old for persistently. Combat. Brenner with the weight of 83 lives saved, the second man was 19. With the recognition that individual choices matter even when they see why he lacks against larger forces. Brenner made a mark with in the simple truth that a child drew for a soldier in a village square in 1942. Papers in order. Papa said you would go home too. But his eyes held something. We all have that choice. We all face that moment. The look of someone measuring distances, drawing in some angles, possibilities. The question remains. Brenner asked where he'd been the previous afternoon when the attack occurred. The man said he'd been in the fields. Which fields? The western fields. Alone. With his brother. Where was his brother? The man pointed to another man in the group. Brenner separated them. Asked the same questions. The stories matched too perfectly. Rehearsed. Prepared. He made another mark in his notebook. By noon, 17 men had been questioned. 3 were cleared. 14 remained in custody. Brenner stood in the shade of a stone wall, reviewing his notes. The numbers aligned with expectations. In a village this size, 3 to 5 partisan supporters was normal. 14 was high. But that suggested the attack had been locally organized. The entire male population likely knew about it. Chose not to report it. Chose to participate through silence. The doctrine was clear about silence. Oberfuhrer Schmidt had explained it during training at Bad Tolls. In the East, there is no middle ground. A man is either actively loyal or passively disloyal. Passive disloyalty enables partisan operations. Therefore passive disloyalty is active resistance. You will treat it accordingly. Brenner had treated it accordingly in 43 villages. The women remained in the square. They'd been standing for 6 hours. Some sat now. Others leaned against walls. The children had grown quiet. Brenner noticed this. Children usually cried during these operations. Today they were silent. Learning. Watching. Absorbing lessons they would carry forward. Dietrich brought the next group. 8 more men. The screening continued. Questions. Answers. Inconsistencies noted. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The pile of marked names in Brenner's notebook grew. At 3 o'clock, they finished. 21 men marked for detention. 6 cleared. The 6 were released. They walked slowly back to the group of women. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. They understood that any sudden movement could change their status. Brenner consulted his field manual. Page 47 covered detention protocols. Page 49 covered execution guidelines. Both required authorization from battalion command. He walked to the command vehicle to use the radio. The message was encoded. The response took 12 minutes. Authorization granted. Proceed per doctrine. Report outcomes by 1800 hours. Brenner returned to the square. He gave the orders. The 21 men were moved to the wall behind the church. The women began wailing. Some tried to follow. Soldiers pushed them back. Not roughly. Just firmly. Standard procedure. Clean separation. This made everything more efficient. The 21 men stood against the wall. They didn't beg. Most partisan sympathizers didn't. They'd made their choices. They understood consequences. Brenner respected that. It made the work cleaner. Professional. He detailed a firing squad. 8 men. 2 reserve. The mechanics were familiar. Everyone knew their role. The men would be shot. The bodies would be documented. The village would be released with a warning. Future cooperation would be expected. This was the pattern. This was the system. This was how partisan activity was suppressed.